Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm here with Agatha Gurman and Sophia Williams, co-directors of Teens for Press Freedom, a national youth-led organization dedicated to freedom of the press and factual literacy among teens. Thanks so much for speaking to our group of Illinois teen librarians. Let's start your presentation, and then at the end, we'll come back together for a few questions submitted by our librarians. So take it away.
Yeah, thank you for having us. So Teens for Press Freedom is a now international youth-led organization. As you said, we're working toward the freedom of the press, and our mission really began in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, especially with the public jailing of Omar Jimenez, who is a CNN correspondent and who was handcuffed on live TV. And we've worked closely with PEN America in the past, and TPF was really founded on in PEN America's Youth Institute as an advocacy project. So we have close ties with PEN America as well as other organizations. And our main focus is on how young people consume information and how we interact with the news media.
So Teens for Press Freedom is made up of 4 teams. We have over 100 members, and we have a team the news team that makes our weekly news blast. So we summarize the key events that happened in the world over the course of the week, and then kind of send them out to teens across the world so they can consume media in shorter bite-sized pieces and still get a taste of what's happening in the world. We have the media relations team that publishes press releases every month or so about different events happening in the local community regarding press freedom and violations. We also have a workshop team that has weekly workshops about different topics. We had one about China and their COVID policies, about Ukraine and Russia, and different key events in the world, so that teens again can kind of get a better understanding of what's happening, and we can have conversations and talk with people who don't necessarily share the same ideas as us, but still interact with others and kind of break our little bubble. We also have the advocacy team, which is currently working on different schools, their personal schools, and how free speech is being affected in their schools, whether their school newspapers have censorship or not. So it's more of an individual local project, but they have worked with New Voices New York and the Student Press Law Center in the past to pass various legislation in New York State and across the country. We also did our War on Truth campaign, inspired by historical events and historical campaign posters from the Soviet era as well as the Vietnam War era, to kind of promote Teens for Press Freedom and to promote free press across New York City and the country. And lastly, we held our Stand for Speech rally in 2021 in coordination with the Student Press Law Center to pass various bills in New York State. We had several student journalists speak, several lawyers speak, several politicians speak, and it was a great way to sort of do a big kickoff of TPF and introduce TPF to the world and kind of show that we do care about press freedom and legislation in New York State, and that everyone deserves to be listened to, even if they're just a small student journalist at a local high school.
Yeah, and one of the things that we hear a lot as teens advocating for the freedom of the press and media literacy is that Gen Z is the most tech-savvy generation, which is true to an extent. We grew up alongside Apple and Instagram, and while our parents turned to newspapers, libraries, and their local news channel and TV for factual information, we opened TikTok and Twitter, and we spend hours immersed in constantly updating information. And though we may be better at navigating these apps, we're even less able to sort fact from fiction online. Many false claims online begin as disinformation with malicious intent and are genuinely believable to their target audience, which is usually teens. This then leads to the unwitting spread of misinformation. During the pandemic, teens were spending 5 to 7.5 hours every day on social media. And as that huge length of time is spent on social media, we are faced with a barrage of more and more misinformation, and it makes it even more difficult to critically think about the information that we're being presented with on social media. And it's made even harder to do so by apps like Instagram, which target teens and pour hundreds of millions of dollars into marketing to woo young people. And they're especially interested in hooking kids early as 12 or 13, into spending hours on their sites. And this, willingly or not, contributes to a rise in misinformation and contributes to the spread of disinformation through teens and through teens to their peers, even if maybe their peers don't spend as much time on social media. And a new study has shown that even younger people, ages 4 to 15, spend an average of 80 minutes per day on TikTok. And now TikTok isn't just on TikTok, it's Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, Spotlight on Snapchat, because these social media companies figured out early that TikTok had hacked the algorithm. The short videos are easily accessible. They satisfy the short attention spans, which are growing even shorter among teens. And it's really easy to just scroll by something and absorb a piece of false information, even if you didn't really look at the post or the content. And so it's a pipeline. Kids get hooked at an early age, and social media companies make more money.
There's also this sort of coolness factor that comes with being politically engaged. We see these different mood boards all over Instagram that sort of force young people to craft this monolithic online persona. They're encouraging us to be just this one person. You have to either fit into this literature student aesthetic or this forest core aesthetic, or an art student who works in the studio alone at lunch breaks. You have to be this super niche specific person, but you cannot really be yourself. And these mood boards kind of define a certain brand and crowd the Instagram Explore page. So there are things like Tooth Fairy Core, bookstore owner, things like that. We want to fit into a certain archetype, and we carefully curate our posts to fit that archetype. And as a generation that should pride itself, and generally does pride itself, on being engaged in politics, this usually means sewing your political ideas into your social persona. We see that a lot in people's Instagram bios. So people will put their political leaning in there. They'll be like, oh, I'm a Marxist, I'm a conservative, I'm a Trump supporter. Before you even follow that person, you see what they're posting, you see their political ideas, who they align with, what kind of ally they are, what they believe in. You know all about them without even seeing who they are. So you kind of know whether this is someone you want to associate with or not, and that puts us into this bubble. It keeps us from interacting with other people because we have an assumption in our head about who they are just based on what they've put in their bio. On top of that, there's a rhetoric within political and social circles. It's all the same. So there is rarely discussion within political groups. On Instagram stories, we see these infographics super often. They're posts condemning terrorist attacks and political atrocities, and they're intermingled with pictures of sunsets and friends. People are kind of diminishing the significance of events in the world, of hurricanes, of earthquakes, of natural disasters, of mass shootings, things like that, to just make them look aesthetic and pretty. That's how you get people's attention, unfortunately. And when politics moves into social media, political ideas become indistinguishable from who you are. Gen Z doesn't associate with people who have opposing political beliefs. We don't talk to each other if we don't align politically. We kind of vilify those with the opposite political leanings and shut down any chance of discourse. We don't want to communicate. So we're not associating with the other side. People ask you, if you're not posting about what's going on, do you actually know what's going on? Do you not care about politics? Do you not care about the rest of the world? Why aren't people talking about this? Many infographics in place of productive conversation are like all over Instagram, and that's not the way to have a conversation. Instagram is not the way to show that you care politically. To show that you care politically is going out there and doing something about it. It's not posting a 5-slide infographic on your story that looks pretty and matches your own Instagram aesthetic. That's not showing that you really do care and that you're actually politically involved. It's just a ton of virtue signaling, which is just showing others how politically correct you are without actually being politically involved. And not everyone can have a unique political take, but people are just reposting and reposting and feel like they've done their work for the day just by posting an infographic on a story. It's kind of political engagement that relieves the moral obligation to engage in politics. It's kind of the mindset that, oh, I post on Instagram, so I'm done for the day. And this isn't a legitimate way to engage in politics. It's kind of providing this unlimited confidence because you look cool to your 1,000 followers, but it doesn't actually mean anything. Things start to become contentious, kind of people post these things as we see here. If you don't agree with this post, then please don't leave hate, just unfollow. It's kind of, if you don't agree with me, stop talking to me. That's not productive. And over half of Gen Z students think that shouting over a speaker is sometimes or always acceptable when it comes to political debate. We don't want to hear each other out. We want to shut each other down. So you can see this idea of the monolithic online persona represented in Congress. Even adults, Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance here, they don't face situations of dissent in the way young people do because they're already steadfast in their political beliefs. They were kind of a Democrat or Republican for several voting cycles, and they've stuck with that. But social media clearly has an effect on the political beliefs, and personal habits of adults, and we see this represented in the highest, most important place of discourse in American democracy, our Congress. Our government is at a standstill because no one can cross party lines. No bills can get through the filibuster, and absolutism is rampant. People don't want to talk to each other, they want to shout over each other. And in this video, we're going to see Debbie Dingell and Marjorie Taylor Greene argue over abortion rights on the steps of the Capitol.
Taylor Greene, back in the spotlight this week, this time involved in a shouting match with Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell yesterday on the steps of the Capitol over Democrat support for a bill protecting women's rights to have abortion access. Take a listen.
Maybe up until birth is a lack of stability. It's called murder. Down there, lack of stability. How about lack of laws or protecting and upholding our Constitution?
Oh boy, Margaret. And then, Debbie Dingell would, tweet this, hold my pearl. So how is all this being received, this kind of public altercation?
I mean, forget about the Democratic caucus. I'd say the majority of the Republican caucus is sort of horrified by this particular lawmaker, but she derives so much of her fundraising and buzz from notoriety and from kind of viral things like this that go viral, that I think she does feel that it does advantage her. For Democrats, that balancing act is, what's the point of losing your temper? I think the concern for leaders in both parties is 2022 going to be a midterm year when there's an expansion of members like this, or there's still sort of a marginal number of members who they have to deal with in this fashion?
All right. All right.
Okay. And so we see such absolutism and such polarization represented in our political leaders, and it's so reminiscent of the discourse that happens on social media. And this polarization is so dangerous to American democracy because of the idea of the echo chamber and the idea of confirmation bias. And people see misinformation that's curated to fit their beliefs. And so obviously they're more likely to believe misinformation that aligns with their political or personal ideologies. So according to a Pew Research Center study, people who rely on social media for their news are less politically informed. So for example, you see this headline on Vanity Fair, Amy Coney Barrett about to be confirmed to the Supreme Court sees a scenario in which abortion should be punishable by death. This is not true. She never said that. And we see these sort of alarmist, extremist headlines all over social media, and they're designed to get clicks, and clicks equals revenue. So a lot of times it's a competition to see what extreme or sensational headline can be used to get people to click on it. And the most insane content wins, and they get the clicks because people want to know what's happening and why these crazy things are being posted, even if they're not entirely true. And people are so afraid of being canceled for not believing in these things that align with their political ideologies, so they don't think critically, and they refuse to see the other side of the story because it doesn't align with their ideologies. So sensationalism has been a part of American culture since the beginning of modern journalism. There was yellow journalism with William Randolph Hearst, the Blame the Maine on Spain scandal, which happened when the USS Maine was exploded, and everyone believed that it was Spain who was responsible for the deaths of those soldiers, and the journalism of the time convinced the American people that this was true, even when it wasn't. There are also intense smear campaigns, propaganda. The Daisy ad by Lyndon Baines Johnson against Barry Goldwater are all examples of ways that sensationalism has been ingrained into American culture since the beginning. And this has only intensified in recent years. People have shorter attention spans, and they're not willing to dig deeper into an issue and do their research. And this also contributes to click culture. People are scrolling so often at so many hours of the day, and to get someone to click is an achievement. And so sources try and get clicks, and clicks equal revenue, as they said. And so when you're blindly swiping through content, you're absorbing information whether you know it or not. And things that are misleading, like gossip, drama, inflammatory opinions, etc., are more profitable. Lies sell. And so here on the slide, you can see one of our workshops on this topic on tabloids, which are sort of an earlier form of the sensationalism. But the difference is that people read tabloids. They thought critically about it because they knew that tabloids were meant to be sensationalist. But with social media, when the true news and the true information is mixed together with the sensationalist and the misleading, it's so difficult to differentiate fact from fiction. And the idea of the echo chamber is only worsened and intensified with the idea of customizable pages. So when users can curate what they see on social media, it becomes so much more difficult to be exposed to opinions other than your own. And this leads to further political polarization, which then causes further absorption of misinformation. And it's a true cycle. And it's not just Parler, which is an actual news app that allows users to curate what they see. It's TikTok too, with its endless customizable For You page that keeps users scrolling through for hours through content tailored just for them. There's all sorts of different sort of TikTok subcategories. There's witch talk, there's mushroom talk, there's frog talk. There's all sorts of different sort of niche areas of social media apps that people can get lost in for hours. And even though witch talk might seem harmless, when it becomes centered around political ideologies and news, it becomes really dangerous to the American democratic psyche. And these apps are designed to allow us to retreat into these echo chambers that tell us what we want to hear. Nothing is going to challenge what you're already consuming. And more than that, everything is taken out of context. So you can see a piece of information or see the viewpoint of a political leader or see some blatantly untrue information, but if it doesn't contradict what you already believe, it's so much harder to think critically about that. So for example, you see this woman who says that the U.S. Constitution states that if a president is impeached by the House but not convicted by the Senate, that person's first term is nullified and they are eligible to run for office 2 more times. So this is untrue again, and engagement with social media is such a passive activity. People are not induced to fact check what they see. So if you saw this on TikTok, you would probably believe it, even if you didn't know much, like especially if you didn't know much about the way that our election processes work, and especially if you are a Trump supporter. It aligns with your political beliefs and it makes you believe what you want to believe, and that is dangerous. And even more than that, people will repost statements they saw on other platforms without fact checking them or double checking them. So if somebody reposts this TikTok, for example, it reaches a wider audience, and you didn't know that it was disinformation when you posted it. So it reaches a wider audience and it influences the friends and family that follow you. In addition, satire and virality creates a cesspool of misinformation where it's hard to distinguish a joke from an opinion from news. In the past, we had newspapers where there's a clearly denoted opinion section, a clearly denoted news section, and same thing with television and radio. The tone of someone's voice speaks so much to the content of their words. And when you don't have that through the text on social media or the sensationalist headlines, it becomes so much more difficult to distinguish what's satire and what's not, what's someone's opinion and what's not. And it all sort of becomes jumbled together, and people are not able to distinguish one from the other.
And things are only going to get worse. We've got the metaverse, which is Mark Zuckerberg's kind of creation. And others have been talking about this new cyberspace, which is, as we can see, the metaverse. Whether or not you believe in it, it's going to catch on. And we are on a steady trajectory to a more immersive, all-consuming virtual world. And that's only going to amplify the consequences of social media, making cancel culture more powerful as more and more of our lives move online and into this online space, and our social status is just reduced to likes, followers, and hashtags. We also have been seeing the death of local news. According to a study conducted by PEN America, 76% of Americans report trusting their local TV news, and 73% report trusting their local newspapers. By contrast, only 55% of Americans trust national network news, and 59% trust national newspapers. And that was in 2019, before the pandemic. So we can only imagine how these numbers have changed. Advertising revenue has decreased and gone to social media, marketing, making print news virtually obsolete and deeply cutting the revenue of local newspapers, which means that these things that people once trusted, they can't anymore because they're not being funded. People don't know where to go. There's also location tracking, and between 2002 and 2012, classified ads reduced their revenue 71% from 15 million to 4 million. We have this quote from Margaret Sullivan, who's the author of Ghosting the News. One problem with losing local coverage is that we never know what we don't know. Corruption can flourish, taxes can rise, public officials can indulge their worst impulses. We just don't know what is going to happen without local news when everything is on social media, and it's just increasingly difficult to distinguish fact from fiction. Okay, we've got another video. This is by Teens for Press Freedom.
Local newspapers provide news about the issues most relevant to their communities. And yet, over 65 million Americans live in news deserts. News deserts are communities with either no or very few local newspapers and who have very limited access to credible news.
Teens for Press Freedom is an organization dedicated to protecting the free press and teaching young people how to be smart, active consumers of news. The dire state of our nation's local newspapers is a problem that's often overlooked, but access to community news is one of the most essential tenets of a free press.
National news sources are meant to represent a wide range of opinions and ideas, but because larger newspapers need to address so many different topics, many issues are then oversimplified.
Local newspapers, while far from being perfectly objective, offer a perspective tailored to the concerns of a more local
Because of this, national politics and policy debates can be enhanced by more individual perspectives and more positive, community-centered debate. Local news outlets can provide a solid foundation upon which a community can build trust, cooperation, and mutual understanding. But in order for small publications to do their work, they need to be protected.
So that was a video that TPF made for a competition, and it talks about the importance of local news and the importance of community-centered journalism that informs people about what's going on in their area. And that brings us to the vilification of journalists. In recent years, especially during the time when Trump was president, he declared a so-called war on journalism. He said that journalists are among the most dishonest human beings on earth, and he posited journalists as an enemy of the people, and condemned factual reporting as fake news to convince people that his version of reality held true. And you can see this pattern reflected in many other leaders around the world. Boris Johnson, for example, did much of the same thing. And it's the weaponization of the term fake news. It became associated with Trump and not associated with the actual concept of misinformation and misleading news. And as a result of not Trump's reign necessarily, but as a result of the rise in social media news and the rise in extremist ideologies being posited on social media, there is an extreme rise in conspiracy theories during the past few years, and these conspiracy groups such as QAnon thrive on a warped version of reality. Only some facts, only one part of the picture are chosen to be believed because they fit within the narrative of the conspiracy. And this is just an extreme example of things that we as social media users do every day. We look at our social media page, which is curated for us, and we believe what's on it most of the time, unless we're willing to do extra research, which the average person doesn't. And people convince themselves that these half-truths are in fact factual because they're incomplete. And this causes the vilification of journalists. It makes people believe that journalists are liars and frauds because they've convinced themselves that their version of reality holds true. And it's not just America, it is a global issue. Journalists are being persecuted and vilified in the US, but they are also being persecuted and vilified around the world. In fact, many authoritarian regimes use the press to amplify their power. For example, nearly all of North Korea's mass media originates from the Korean Central News Agency, a government-run outlet. International correspondents are detained and expelled from the nation most of the time. In addition, the Philippines is a country where the freedom of the press has been highly contended for the last few years. Maria Ressa, the CEO of Rappler, said that our dystopian present is your dystopian future. If the US continues on the path that we're going down with the censorship of journalism and the censorship of factual information, we're going to end up in the space that the Philippines and other countries with intense censorship laws are in now. And that's really what Ressa is saying. Maria Ressa continues to be arrested by Philippine authorities for her criticism of the government. And what's scary is that we can see journalists being arrested in America, especially during the Black Lives Matter protests. So the vilification of journalists is a huge issue in the US and around the world. And what Teens for Press Freedom aims to do is find ways that teens can be involved in this and bring some levity and solutions to this enormous issue.
Yeah, so on a perhaps more inspirational note, we're going to talk about some solutions that you as educators and librarians, as people who just work with teens who are kind of plagued by this issue, can implement. So perhaps what I find the most helpful and actually super shocking is my school has a research class that is mandatory. It's one semester freshman year, so kids can kind of understand MLA formatting, things like that. they can also understand what a credible news source is and what credible news looks like. This isn't a mandatory part of the New York State curriculum. I actually don't think it is part of any curriculum in the country, which is shocking because this is just something basic. It's pretty useful for college when you have to use MLA formatting, but it's also a key step to understand what good news and what the truth actually looks like. So organizing some sort of news literacy class in a school or in your library to assemble and educate students on the importance of credible sources and how to find them is pretty basic start, but also super important. There are research classes, it meets twice a week, just kind of talk about how to properly cite sources and also how to identify a credible source, kind of the difference between a .com, a .edu, a .org, etc., and what they all mean, and differentiate between media literacy in an academic forum and media literacy in a format that is applicable to everyday life, because as we just spoke about, it's super relevant with social media to differentiate between what is real and what is fake. It's also important to not just focus on the factual, to discuss cultural aspects of media literacy and how to spot mis and disinformation, what the difference between mis and disinformation is, and to approach it through the lens of social media to make it more approachable to teens, to be like, hey, you guys spend upwards of 6 hours on this site, let's talk about it, let's see, and kind of break down what you're seeing, what's real, what's fake, here's how to tell the difference, and here's how to apply it to your daily life in something that you do for so long every day. And almost all teens are familiar with social media activism, things like that, and will have an opinion on it. So they are more likely to be engaged in something that they care about.
Yeah, and what's really important, in addition to the education portion of it, is to facilitate student discussions between peers about current events. The way our generation typically communicates is so fractured, and the ability to have informed conversation is one that should be cultivated and isn't really being supported right now in our education system. And a great way to elaborate on this is through examples. In my experience, teens are more likely to invest themselves in something if they believe it truly has a negative effect on them and their peers. And CPF workshops are an example of this. We have productive conversations every week, and it's a skill that can be practiced. After several years of workshops, conversations have become less repetitive and more nuanced, and the ideas that are being presented are less one-sided. They may be bipartisan. They may align with different views on the political spectrum or different social ideologies, and it's productive. We have a conversation with a real person and not the passive and repetitive persona that they present online. And as such, there's more flexibility and compassion, even with differing opinions. And so we ask educators to approach media literacy with compassion to help make your students aware about the detriment of engaging in discourse on social media.
Yeah, I think that's all we have for today.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you for sharing all of your passion and the powerful work that you guys are doing. I do have a few questions for you from our librarians that were submitted online ahead of time. So I can go ahead and ask those. So the first question that was submitted is, what inspired you, both of you, to get involved with Teens for Press Freedom?
So I have always been a journalist at heart. My mom was a journalist, and I knew that I wanted to be on the school newspaper when I went to my high school. And when I got there, I realized that a lot of the privileges that I had at my school, the ability to write on what we want, the ability to criticize our school, is not something that is afforded to many teen journalists across the country. And so I got involved with PEN America first, ironically enough, and I met Isabel and those at PEN America who were working on Teens for Press Freedom. And I just thought that it was the perfect opportunity for me to advocate for these issues that I was so passionate about. And I started by working on our newsletter, and I just had so much love for this program and what we do here that I just wanted to be more and more involved.
Yeah. I actually went to school with Charlotte and Isabel, so I kind of had that like personal connection with them at first. But I remember in 2021, we were still in lockdown. I had been doing a lot of work for a bunch of youth organizations in regards to like climate change and things like that. And I had organized a protest in April, and Charlotte came and she's like, a lot of people post about this on social media, but nobody shows up to these things. And that kind of spoke to me. And that's when I realized, oh, social media is just a way to like virtue signal. It's not a way to actually show that you care about these things. And that's why I decided to get involved with Teens for Press Freedom, because I wanted to kind of encourage other teenagers to show that it's not all about social media. We can go out there and we can do things and we can make change. Even though we're 15, 16, 17 years old, it is possible. And it's just inspiring to be part of this.
Thanks, that's really inspiring. So the next question I have from another librarian is, I have taught media literacy to high schoolers and they seem very bored. Do you have any ideas for how to get teens engaged with this topic? I know you addressed that a little bit during your presentation, but if you have anything to add, that would be great.
Yeah, I think we so often approach media literacy as an academic discipline, which it is, and it's so useful for research purposes, but media literacy is not just for academia. It's for everyday life, and it's a skill that can be exercised all the time, especially on social media. And I think that making teens aware that media literacy is so applicable to their everyday lives would make it a little bit more engaging. I know that a lot of my friends think that media literacy is just knowing difference between a .com and a .org and a .edu. And while that's an important part of it, it's also important to know that media literacy is determining between fact and fiction online and recognizing the dangers that you are faced with when you're on social media.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Sophia said. I think that because our generation spends so much time online, it really is important to show them that media literacy is an important skill to have when you're scrolling on social media, and just how dangerous social media can be, how much misinformation and disinformation is spread on there, and how they can actually be spreading false information without even realizing it. I guess not necessarily using a scare tactic, but kind of explaining to them that they are part of the issue here if they are unknowingly spreading false information and misinforming other people. So it's important that they realize to fact check if they're going to share information on social media. If they are going to get their news from social media, to at least do it from like Instagram accounts of newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, of the Wall Street Journal, just to make sure that the sources that you are getting your news from and the ways that you are informing yourself are credible and are valid ways. So tying it into something that they spend so much time on is important, because that kind of grasps their attention and shows them that they are interacting with mis and disinformation on a daily basis.
Thanks, that's good advice, tying it into real world news and applications and social media. The next question we have is, suppose that you saw a friend from your school sharing this information on social media. What would you do?
Yeah, this has actually happened to me before. I've been talking with friends and one of them would bring up something and I would just think to myself, I would say, wait, that doesn't make much sense. And so I would either do my own research or encourage them to do their own research. And when they share false information, it's important not to act as though they are ignorant or, unwilling to change. It's important that people learn. And I think teens, more than anyone, have so much to learn about everything. And I think when that education can be reinforced by their peers, of course, in a kind and friendly way, it really helps. And, when I see a friend who's believing in some misinformation, I just sort of question it. I say, well, do you really know where that's coming from? Or is there a way that you could fact check that? Because it does pose a danger to teens more than anyone when somebody is spreading false information.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think that maybe to prevent it from happening in the future, it's important to have conversations with them, to talk to them and be like, hey, what do you think about this topic? Maybe we don't agree, but let's talk it out so we can see kind of what you're thinking, what I'm thinking, and we can understand each other better, and kind of explain to them what misinformation is, what the dangers of it are, and kind of instill that idea to fact check and to double check before reposting, and to be able to spot false information online. Because though there are some like flags on Instagram and Twitter, I believe, of just like, oh, this information isn't verified, it's not on everything, and it's not always true. So it's important to kind of distinguish and understand what is real, what is fake, and talk to them about it and teach them about it. It's not a bad thing to inform someone. It's not a bad thing to call someone out. Just approach it kind of kindly and don't make a fuss about it. Just kind of explain, hey, this happened. Let's prevent it in the future. Let's talk about it.
That's great. You guys are your own best advocates with your friends when you see that happening. The last question I have is a doozy. It's kind of a long one, so do your best with it. So a librarian asked, she posed a scenario the other day in our teen space. This librarian heard a YouTube video being watched by a middle school student. The student who is white was watching a video where someone who is Black was asking why white people should have to celebrate Black History Month and why people would want to celebrate the accomplishments of others. And the librarian felt like she did okay at the moment. She asked what he was watching, tried to point out some obvious flaws in the argument, but the student wasn't interested in engaging about the video and got defensive. So she said that she knows Google is working on changing the algorithms presentation, which you talked a little bit about, of more and more radical content, but she's afraid that the student is already a few clicks down the path into content that can lead to, more radical beliefs. So she was looking for a teen perspective on, best ways to handle a situation like that, or engage with students who are, in that moment in the teen area, the conversation that you could have. And have you seen that sort of thing happen? Have you seen a good approach maybe at your school?
This one's tricky just because it's so hard to tell people not what they should or should not watch, but for lack of a better term, what content they should be consuming on social media. And I think it's just reinforcing that critical lens. And I know that maybe students may seem defensive, and I think that one strategy to helping with that is to reinforce their peers' idea of misinformation and maybe radical content. And I think that peer reinforcement and helping each other is maybe sometimes even more effective than when a teacher is explaining a concept, or when a teacher is sort of not reprimanding, but helping a student with maybe some content that might be radical. I think that maybe having other teens help that student, or maybe telling other teens that if they see a student watching a video like that they should speak up and say something, because it may make an impact on their views.
Yeah, I also think that it's important. I don't obviously wasn't there. I don't remember the entire situation, but it might be important to kind of clarify, hey, I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I'm just trying to understand what exactly it is that you're watching and why you're believing this argument or why you're disagreeing with this argument. Try to just get to the why, try to see the other person's side and clarify that it's not a bad thing to engage in a conversation, that you're not trying to argue with them. I think that teens, we're kind of in that phase right now where we think that anyone who approaches us and says something that we disagree with is an enemy, and that's not true. We just haven't realized that yet. So I guess it's important to clarify the true kind of intention, your intentions, and go from there. I totally agree with what Sophia said with including peers, because we kind of follow others. We look at other people's examples and we want to be like them. So it's important to kind of include the peers that we're surrounded by and kind of follow in this scenario.
Thank you. Those are good answers.